Welcoming all of you to our next webinar in the 2021 spring webinar series we've been putting on. Today's talk is going to be on advances in understanding chemical control of emerald ash borer. So I'll go through, do an introduction right now. I'm going to introduce myself first. My name is Eric Lindberg. I'm the lead technical advisor for Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements. Been here for about 4 years now. I work a lot with companies, municipalities, on a variety of different things, but emerald ash borer is one of the main things that I work on in helping implement effective management plans around this. But it is my pleasure to introduce all of you to Dr. Cliff Sadof. He's a professor of entomology at Purdue University, where he works as extension specialist for insect problems in urban forests, and also serves as the Indiana's Integrated Pest Management co-author. Additionally, as co-author of the Midwestern Regional Bulletin on Chemical Control of Emerald Ash Borer, he has conducted numerous efficacy trials on this pest. He's also worked with colleagues at Purdue to develop a free Purdue tree doctor and shrub doctor apps to help landscape managers improve their abilities to diagnose pest problems. So we're really happy to have Cliff here today to be talking. And one last thing as well, I just want to go over some housekeeping items for today. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box using the control panel. At the end of this talk, we'll be answering those questions at the end. Also, this webinar is being recorded and a link will be sent out to all of you at the completion of the webinar. This webinar is also worth 1 CEU, ISA CEU. If you did not enter in your certification number during registration, please type that into the Q&A portion. Additionally, if you are in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, or Utah, this talk today does allow for state pesticide credits, and we will have a link to provide to you at the end of this webinar, and then some instructions on how to obtain those credits. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand this over to Dr. Cliff Sadof to present today.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen and we should be in business. Okay, so if all is going well, you should be seeing a screen that says Understanding Chemical Control of Emerald Ash Borers. Okay, so it's hard to believe that emerald ash borer has been here in the United States, was detected in 2002, so we're pushing up to 19 years that we've been working with this beast. And I tell you, we have learned an awful lot about controlling this pest in the past 2 decades. Let's see, I'm going to click here. All right. So one of the things that it's really important for you to know is that our team, led by, Dan Herms, put together a bulletin called Insecticide Options for Protecting Ash Trees from Emerald Ash Borer. We have all the information in this one bulletin because we want to make sure we're reading from the same text, because when you all have the same information, you could all make much better informed decisions, and it's available at emeraldashborer.info. So a lot of what I'm talking about is reviewed in here, and then I'll be talking about some new information that is subject to some active research programs that I'm involved with right now. So I'm going to cover how insecticides kill emerald ash borer, how long protection lasts over time, and I'm going to touch on some of the new research that I'm doing right now about how the number of injection ports are really important, because it affects the proportion of the leaves that actually receive the insecticide and the duration of protection over time. And then I'm going to talk about a new way called slow ash mortality, which is a way to get more out of 2-year treatment intervals. And I'll review some work that we did with a number of companies to examine how well it worked in some real live situations. Okay, so let's start now about how insecticides kill emerald ash borer. All right. So one of the things we know, I'll start by reviewing the life cycle. Right now, the emerald ash borer is uh, most likely in the J-shaped larvae or pre-pupae just beneath the bark. It'll pupate in some actually are wintering as pupae, but it'll definitely be pupate. It'll come out in May, and then they have leave these characteristic D-shaped exit holes. Then the adults will come out in May. They will mate. The adult female will feed on the leaves. She'll then lay eggs on the bark. The egg hatches into a larva that chews directly through the trunk, and then it feeds on the underside of the trunk, causing these characteristic zigzag galleries. So that's the biology in a nutshell. So one of the things that we know is that this insect has got to feed on leaves for about 7 to 10 days before it can start laying eggs because it has to mature her eggs. And that behavior of feeding on the leaves is what we're exploiting. The insecticides that we use, whether we are putting uh, pouring insecticide around the base of the tree, or we are injecting the tree or injecting the soil, the material goes up through the vascular system, up into the leaves, and they can be exposed to the insecticide when they're feeding on the leaves. Also, uh, some of the larvae can also be killed when they are feeding on the phloem, which is contaminated by the insecticide that moves over from the xylem. So let's look at the different types of insecticides that we have here. I'm going to focus today on emamectin benzoate, but I think that there's some really good data to show that imidacloprid and dinotefuran and even azadirachtin are all part of the toolkit that you could use to control emerald ash borer. But emamectin benzoate protects trees of all sizes. Dinotefuran and imidacloprid only is effective on the smaller trees, and emamectin benzoate has to be applied every 2 to 3 years, depending on the kind of control program you're involved with. Whereas the dinotefuran and the imidacloprid has to be applied every single year. All of these all these insecticides will kill the first and second instar larvae, whereas emamectin benzoate only will kill all stages of larvae, and it takes only 1 or 2 bites. It's very highly toxic to the adults. Azadirachtin does not kill the adults, it just reduces the fecundity of the adults. And one of the things that's really important you have to remember is that because we're talking about systemic insecticides, you have to be sure that your trees are heavily irrigated. So if you have a drought situation after you apply your insecticide, you want to make sure that you irrigate that tree so that material moves from the injection site or from the place where you poured it into the soil, through the roots, up through the xylem, and up into the leaves. Okay, so let's talk about why so many injection ports. Well, I think many of you might have heard about a product that was around for a little while called Brant Ontree EB emamectin benzoate. It was the same product that's in mectinite. Okay, it's just it was inside these bags and these capsules that you would have. They recommended 4 points, 4 ports for a 20-inch DBH tree, which is half the number that you would use using the Q-Connect or the Tree IV type of a system. And we were doing some work to compare the efficacy of these, and we injected these trees in 2016, and then we measured the canopy thinning. And the top line in this graph over here represents the canopy thinning over time on the trees that received no insecticides. So we started, there was about maybe 15% canopy thinning of the untreated trees. And by 2017, it went up to closer to 50%. And it slowly went up and up until about maybe close to 80% canopy thinning by 2019. Whether we used mectinite or whether we used triage, both those products kept the canopy thinning uh, well below 10%. Okay, so that's excellent control. Uh, but what we found was that so we had good control for the first 2 years when we used only 4 injection points, and it started to break apart, in 2018, and then by 2019 we really started seeing some real clear differences between the 4-port injection devices and the 8 ports. So if you go to 4 ports, you might save some labor in getting that product in there, but the level of control that you're going to get is not going to be. You'll get good control for 1 year, but you're going to have to. You might lose some control in that second year, and then in that third year, things really go awry. So, what does that mean? We actually did some analysis where we collected leaves from 5 different parts of the canopy, and we looked at the concentration of the leaves of the insecticide in the leaves from the different types of devices, and we found that the mectinite, just as this formulation of emamectin benzoate, is taken up a lot faster than the original triage product. We have more of it in there than in the triage product, and both these have more than the entree, which is the 4 port system. But by a month, basically, the triage and the mectinite, catch up. But the entree just doesn't really give enough that much product inside there. And then the other thing that we found was that both both products that we use 8 ports per 20-inch DBH tree, we found that we had nearly 100% of the leaves had enough insecticide to kill the emerald ash borer, whereas the uh, entree only had about 60% of the leaves with insecticide. So we're not getting nearly the amount of coverage that we need. And this is kind of interesting, that we still had control with only 60% coverage, and that's because emamectin benzoate is so toxic, and the beetles do move around a bit. When it went from when it fed on an untreated leaf, it would then eventually feed on a treated leaf, and that 1 or 2 bites on a treated leaf would be enough to kill it. But it just didn't last for as long when you only have 60% of the leaves that are treated. Okay, so let's ask, how long does protection last? So this slide here is a slide of uh, 2 ash trees in a place called Eagle Creek Park in Indiana, just outside of Indianapolis. And the tree on the left has a DBH, a diameter breast height, of about 40 inches, and the one on the right wasn't treated. So you can see these products have a tremendous potential to save trees. Now, even large trees. Now, here's a study I want to talk about that was published a couple of years ago by my colleague Deb McCulloch, and they did some work on forest-grown green ash trees, 8 replicates, and the trees varied between 21 and 31 inches DBH. They used dinotefuran as a basal trunk spray, kind of like the Transtec product. They used imidacloprid imicide injection capsules, and then emamectin as a triage injection. And what they did was they started it in 2008, and they applied the insecticides either triennially, which means once every 3 years, or annually, which means every single year. And then what they did was that so they started in 2008, and 6 years later, after going through a 6-year cycle, they dissected the trees to see how many larvae were underneath the trees, which is actually the most accurate way to assess the effectiveness of an insecticide. And what they found was that when they applied nothing, there were about 35 larvae per meter square of bark. Okay, so they peeled up the equivalent of the bark. They standardized the measure to per meter squared. They've got about 35 larvae per meter squared, living larvae. Similarly, if they applied dinotefuran once every 3 years, they had the same number of larvae. Okay, so clearly, that's not going to work if you apply it once every 3 years. But if you apply it once every, but if you, I've lost my okay, if you apply it once every year, there are very few larvae that are alive. So annual applications on these trees as a safari, these dinotefuran products as a basal trunk spray, with using Safari or Transtech, will work quite well. Okay, now imidacloprid uh, had when you applied triennially or annually, there were a lot more live larvae. So it's a lot less toxic than the dinotefuran, but you still have some level of control. Now, what's interesting here is that when we use the high rate of application, which is 5 milliliters per inch, which is what I use in most of all my trials, they couldn't find a single live larvae. And then when they did this, whether they were treating it annually or once every 3 years. Okay. And the same thing, if they use a low rate, they found one live larvae. So you can see this little tiny little bar sticking up here. So basically, this is really rock solid evidence to show that if you inject a tree, you're going to be killing, you'll be able to have, you'll be suppressing the larval population for 3 years if with the ivermectin benzoate. Okay, so what does this really mean in terms of reducing canopy thinning? So I'm going to take you back to Eagle Creek, where we applied. We're using the triage product, but for all intents and purposes, this is going to work the same as the ivermectin benzoate product, which I'll show you in a later slide. We applied it in 2013 when there was less than 10% canopy thinning on all the trees. And when we applied it in the spring, uh, we killed the emerald ash borer, okay, for at least 2013 and 2014. And so we kept the thinning down for 14 and in 15. So we kind of coasted because after you kill all the larvae, they have to reinfest the tree to start causing more damage. And then in the year that we coasted, where we did not have much in the way of protection in 2015, because the population of emerald ash borers were so high, we started seeing an increase in the canopy thinning on trees that were treated in the spring and trees that were treated in the fall. Another thing that's important to note is that the fall treatment of the trees is when we waited till the fall, we allowed those trees to be killed, to be fed on by the beetles for an entire summer before we actually hit it. So that's why we're seeing a difference in the actual canopy thinning. So fall can be less effective than spring, especially if you're at the peak of emergence. But then we applied it again in 2016, and what's really interesting to hear is that at this point you have the most pressure, okay, because you have a lot of the beetles are out, and then at this point by 2017, after we lose that second year of kill, all the untreated trees are dead, and there's very low pressure. There are very few emerald ash borer around to attack trees. So we wound up having sustained reductions in canopy thinning through 2019. And it wasn't until last summer that we started seeing the canopy thinning starting to pick up again. So we're talking 1, 2, 3, arguably almost even 4 years of control. So if this was, say, a client, when you start noticing a little thinning, if you apply it again in 2021 on this 5-year interval, that would be enough to knock things back. So the population pressure really has an important impact on the levels of control. Okay, let's look at another site where we compared triage and mectinite. Okay, and this was done at the Lafayette golf courses. We had 13 trees per treatment. And it's slightly different than the Eagle Creek study in that this used the rate which at the time was popular, was called the Chicago method, that instead of treating all the trees at 5 mils per inch DBH, when trees reached, this is on the old labels, you might remember this, once you reached 20 inches DBH, they had a gradation of an increase of the number of the amount of mils per inch up until you got to 40 inches, so that you could actually so that it increased it until you got to 40 inches, till you got to 10 mils per inch. And so this is what this was how so there's more insecticide that was put in there. But what's interesting here is that, we applied the insecticide in 2013. Population was really high then, but we had excellent control when we were applying this material in the springtime, pretty much throughout. Uh, there was a little bit less effectiveness in the triage product, but whether it's 10% or 5% canopy thinning, the difference is not that much of a difference. But both of these things were at 10% or less up until 2019, and then when we start seeing a resurgence in the population, the control starts to break down. So we got 1, 2, 3, arguably even 4 years of control in that last injection when we're using this higher dose. So take home points is that, I'll go back to the previous slide, is that 5 mils per inch is great even on really really large trees. All right, and the you get better control if you are applying it in the springtime, because you are getting that toxicant into the system uh, before the beetles have another summer to add on the feeding, and then control lasts longer after the initial wave has gone through. Okay. Um, all right. So now, this brings me back to what I like to call the EAB protection cycle. Okay, so basically, let's think of it in terms of what the population of emerald ash borer is doing. So these squares represent the percentage of all the ash which are affected, whether they are trees that are 30%, that have at least 30% thinning, or whether it's uh, you know trees that are dead, some endpoint. And what happens is that, we'll start off, we have this, we'll start off having the number of trees. You start with 1% affected, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. And it's over an 8-year cycle, you have 100% of your trees hitting this critical point. The emerald ash borer population pretty much follows with the abundance of those trees that are expressing those levels of symptoms. And then after all the trees are dying, the population of emerald ash borer goes down, and it sustains at very low levels, and it never really ever goes away. So in 2013, when we applied the insecticide and got 2 years of protection at the Eagle Creek site, we had excellent levels of control. We had good levels of control, but in year 5, when we're hitting, when we're missing that treatment, it allowed the beetles to start, causing more damage. But when we hit it again in 2016, we had 2 years of control, and that put us through until the point where the population of emerald ash borer starts to drop, and there was less of a less pressure. So this just shows it from the standpoint of the overall population dynamics. What's the take home point? The take home point is that early on here you have to be aggressive in your protection, and then after all the untreated trees are basically dead, the population of emerald ash borer is lower, and you could use a different set of products in your toolkit. All right. So what kind of evidence do we have for this level of decline, this rate of decline? So we've done a number of studies with Fort Wayne. Chad Tinkle, the arborist there, was kind enough to share his data, and he showed that that the number of trees that they removed each year pretty much followed our doubling model. Starting with 1%, 2%, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, close to 100%. So the number of trees that we expected to be removed based on our prediction is the black line, and it pretty much tracks the rate of tree removal. Similarly, when we tracked the number of trees that had accumulated at least 30% canopy thinning, we found the same trends. In West Lafayette, we did a long-term study of sensing the trees and tabulating the number of trees that had lost at least 30% of their canopy. And we found that our predicted, this black line was very much like our observed. 2012, we had a horrific drought, so there was a lot more canopy thinning. It rained a lot. It snapped right back onto this curve, and it worked fine. So this works well for 30% canopy thinning, and that's a model that we use to drive our calculations about the progression of the infestation. So healthy trees are worth the protection costs, and this is you probably are familiar with the National Tree Benefit Calculator, treebenefits.com, and it says that a 20-inch white ash in Lafayette, Indiana, is worth about $230. And so it's kind of you're protecting something that has some value. We've also developed this tool called the Emerald Ash Borer Cost Calculator, and available at eabindiana.info, that allows you to stage your infestation. So basically, if you're new to Emerald Ash Borer, starting to know some trees that are starting to decline, you want to know where you are in the system. Uh, uh, Go and take a survey after the leaves have come out, sometime in June. uh, Take a look and estimate the percentage of your trees that have at least 30% canopy thinning, and that'll tell you where you are in your cycle. We did some work where we were assuming bulk costs of and bulk for treating emamectin trees that were for treating trees with emamectin benzoate. We had a forest of about 1,600 ash trees with a range of DBH, from 3 inches all the way to 36 inches. And, this is our distribution of trees. And we made some assumptions about these things that follow the model that I was discussing. And we found that if you start your control tactics early, in year one, just before it's detectable when it's in your county, uh, you will spread out your control costs. So this black line here refers to, we have three strategies we're comparing. One is you replace all your trees that were less than 12 inches, and then treat all trees that had a DBH of greater than 12 inches. And we found a fairly stable, low level of costs throughout a 25-year cycle. If you wanted just to remove all your trees and not treat them, and you do that over time, you could sort of spread those costs out over 8 years so you don't break your annual budget. But if you remove trees as they die, in the last 3 years, they all die, and your budget goes through the roof. Here we have over $500,000 in the last year of the cycle. If you start late, when you start noticing when 16% of the trees have lost more than 30% of their canopy, you compress these costs, and instead of having peaks around $500,000, you have a peak closer to $700,000 if you let them go as they die. So it's always better to start early, and you can contain your costs a little bit better. In terms of what the cumulative costs are over the cost of the entire 25-year simulation, you'll see that when you remove, and whether you're moving or replaces your tree, if you're moving and replacing your trees um, proactively, spread it by whether you're spreading out the cost or whether you are reactively replacing them. Both these options are far more expensive, over $1 million, as opposed to replacing your small trees and treating just your large trees. So it's far less expensive whether you start in year one or whether you start in year 5. All right. And in terms of the benefits, clearly, if you the size of your forest is going to be a lot larger if you save your trees than if you remove and you replace your trees. So this is shows so some really try to show some good evidence to show that the economics of control is there. And what I like about the calculator is that if you want to convince your own municipality that it's worth treating these trees rather than removing and replacing them, you can use your own tree inventories, you can use your own costs for treatment, you can use your own costs for stump grinding, your own costs for transplanting and staking as well. Okay, so now, so we know this is important, but a lot of people still have a hard time spending money on this. So we're trying to see if it's possible to actually lower the costs even more using this concept developed by Deb McCulloch called urban SLAM, slowed ash mortality. The way this works is that we try to poison the beetles by only treating 40% of the canopy with emamectin benzoate, this very highly toxic compound. The idea is that the poisoned leaves will kill the adult females as they skip around from leaf to leaf. And we know this is the case because earlier on I showed you that slide where we treated trees and only 60% of the canopy had only 6% of the 60% of the leaves in the canopy had enough poison to kill the beetles. So and it actually reduced the accumulation of injury. So, but here the idea is that by uh, having 40% of your leaves toxic, you can slow the population buildup, and that slows ash mortality in many cases. Saves trees. So we did a test on three college campuses. 40% of the trees were treated, and their trees were evaluated up until 6 years, or until most of the untreated trees died. So one of the things we found, there's a little graphic over here, is that when you start out with just a few trees which are moribund, and I call a moribund tree, which is a tree which is still alive, but it has lost at least 30% of its canopy. When you have very few moribund trees and mostly healthy trees, you're going to have more success than if you have a lot more moribund trees and fewer healthy trees. Because the reason is because you have a lot more beetles, a lot more beetle pressure to attack the trees. And I'll explain. So this is at IU, Indiana University. We started this program in Indiana University when 51% of the trees, or just like I showed you in the graphic, when about half of the trees had lost more than 30% of their canopy. And we tracked the number of unsalvageable trees. Clearly, the trees that were treated with the arbormectin or the mectinite product, uh, uh, we sort of had a slight increase in the number of trees that had increased canopy thinning, but overall, it was a lot better than the untreated trees. So the trees that were untreated just continued their progression, but not all of them died. And they died at a rate that was slower than would have been predicted by our doubling model, because if they doubled at this point, we would expect to go from 60% to close to 100%. So it slowed the rate of of trees that had more than 30% thinning on the untreated trees. But I wouldn't call this acceptable control. However, when we started this in Terre Haute, Indiana, where we started where only 10% of the trees had lost more than 30% of the canopy, we had a much better result. So after 6 years, in year 5, we had about 60% of the untreated trees were still doing just fine, even though that the doubling model would have predicted that there would have been a lot more that would have been dead. So we find that treating trees uh, uh, can indeed protect the untreated trees that are nearby if you start out early. Well, what about species effect? Well, we found in our studies that white ash, Fraxinus americana, was dying at a much slower rate than the green ash. And I think that probably has to do, so this is that's to do with the fact that I think we can detect, that green ash is more susceptible, and it's attacked earlier. So I'll explain this graph. So white ash that was treated with emamectin benzoate, we had almost no increase in the number of trees that lost more than 30% of their canopy. In contrast, the green ash, which was treated with emamectin benzoate, we had a constant but a very slow rate of decline. Okay, but it's faster than the white ash. So white ash seemed to respond better to treatments than the green ash. Similarly, in the control trees, the untreated white ash trees, also we still had 75% of them looking just fine, as compared to having only about only having 20% of them looking just fine in the untreated controls for the green ash. And both these lines are higher than what we would have expected using the doubling model to predict the rate of tree decline. So how close must an ash tree be to protect an untreated ash tree, so treated ashes? So what we found was that if your nearest, so we found that we started seeing differences if your nearest treated tree is less than 20 meters away. Okay, so about 60 feet away. Okay, and that's about so basically, if you have trees that are on a street and they are um, 20 yards apart, okay, then or they're less than 20 yards apart, you can start seeing this effect. If they're more than that, you're not going to see this effect. We had a couple of and then so the other question is, how close to a nearest untreated ash uh, do you have to lower your probability? So basically, if you have an untreated tree next to a treated tree, you're also going to have um, a higher mortality. So having infested trees next to treated trees will reduce the effectiveness of the product. Also, having uh, treated trees near each other, near untreated trees, will reduce the ability of the emerald ash borer to kill the untreated trees. Okay, so what does this look like on a map? Okay, that was pretty abstract. Okay, here's a map of the Terre Haute campus. Okay, it's about a square kilometer. The treated trees are the black dots. The untreated trees are the white dots. And what we found was that a lot of the mortality occurred uh, uh, in when the ash trees were and the untreated trees were far apart. So let's just back up. Okay, so here where the treated trees and the untreated trees were in many places further apart from each other, we saw more of the untreated trees dying than over here. Okay, so here where all the ash trees and are the treated and untreated trees are right next to each other. In many cases, particularly in this street where almost every other tree was treated, we could not tell the difference between treated and untreated trees, even at the end of 5 years. Okay, so basically, a rule of thumb: if canopies are touching, you could probably treat every other tree and be fine. So the third leg is that the proximity of the treated trees to the untreated trees also affects. So here we have a much better chance of control when they're of the untreated trees surviving when they are in close proximity to the treated trees. Whereas if they're further away, they're acting independently. Okay, so in summary, how do you get an urban slam program to work? You the if the most of the trees are healthy, the emerald ash borer population is low, you have a better chance of success than when you have more of your trees are moribund and you have a higher population of beetles. Similarly, because white ash trees decline more slowly than green ash, the more white ash you have, the better off you're going to be in a program. And also the proximity of the treated to the untreated ash trees are also a great influence. So with that, this work was done with an army of people and an army of resources, and Rainbow did help us out a lot with this product. Sam Dram and Emily Bick did great work on this, and we did this on a number of areas. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, and Cliff, what I'll do, I just have a couple slides that we'll go through, and then we'll go
Great.
over the logistics for kind of the CEUs or whatnot at the end, and then we'll answer some questions there if that works.
Perfect.
Sounds great. Go ahead and shift things over. Thank you very much for that presentation. And so what I'm just going to do now is just kind of go over a couple of those toolbox approach things that Cliff Sadof was talking about. And the big thing is, is the toolbox approach with this. By far, and the most time, the product I'll spend the most time talking about is going to be emamectin benzoate. But there are a variety of different products that you can use in order to obtain control with emerald ash borer. And I'll delve further into those. But it comes down to 3 different application methods. First one's going to be soil application. And for those, you're going to be using imidacloprid or dinotefuran. Then you can do a bark spray, a systemic bark spray, and dinotefuran is one that you can use for that. But lastly, tree injection is probably the biggest one that is used, and especially for trees of kind of any size, the larger size, and as well as under high pressure areas. And the active ingredient that's most effective for that is going to be emamectin benzoate. So the first one, Zytect. This is a product we carry. It's Zytect 2F. Active ingredient is imidacloprid. And for this, it's going to be applied as a soil application. And this just mixes up with water and is applied at the base of the tree. And the reason why we apply at the base of the tree is because there's a high concentration of fibrous roots present in that area. And you want to be hitting those fibrous roots in order to get take up throughout that tree and to get protection. And this is an annual treatment for it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on as well. Next one is dinotefuran. And this product we have is Transtect. It's a 70% dinotefuran product that comes in water-soluble packets. And this one can be applied as a soil application, but the really nice thing is this is something that can be applied as a bark spray. And so this allows you to get systemic control by applying this here. What you do is you apply spray to runoff, and you'll be going from the base of the tree to about 4.5 feet up in height. You're going to apply evenly around the trunk, and just kind of give you some guidelines. 1 gallon of ready-to-use solution should be able to treat about 60 to 85 inches DBH. The last one I'll talk about is mectinite, and this one is the active ingredient emamectin benzoate, specifically 4% emamectin benzoate. And so this comes in a 1-quart bottle with a dosing chamber. It is a non-restricted use pesticide, so it has a signal word caution. And out of all of the emamectin benzoates on the market right now, it does have the lowest viscosity, which generally correlates to kind of a faster uptake time with this. And for this as well, the efficacy to date demonstrates equivalency to triage as well as ivermectin, some of the other products on the market. Uptake is equal to that of ivermectin. And what we found is that it tends to be a faster uptake than that of kind of the original triage formulation, some of that Dr. Sadof was talking about earlier. But with this as well is it essentially comes down to the toolbox approach. Where Transtect and Zytect can be an effective tool is if you have kind of some smaller DBH trees and under low to moderate EAB pressure. When using Zytect, the imidacloprid product, you will expect some more dieback than that of emamectin benzoate because it requires some more feeding on it. Transtect is one that it's excellent for remote areas because you can just do a bark spray application. But with that as well, there are some timing concerns, and I'll show that in my next slide. But those ones are good for kind of the low to moderate pressure areas. The one that I like to generally recommend for anyone implementing an EAB treatment plan, whether it is for homeowners or for a larger area, is going to be mectinite. And that's because you can treat trees of any size with that. There aren't really going to be any sort of restrictions associated with it. It's great for some of the areas under the moderate to high pressure because it's highly toxic to those emerald ash borers. So it doesn't require a lot of feeding in order to obtain control. Additionally, with it, it will control some round-headed borers and some of the native borers as well. So getting down to some of the timing with this, this is kind of key. Whenever you're doing applications with Zytec, you either want to be doing those kind of in the early spring portion or a little bit later down in the fall. And this is because it only lasts for 1 year. And it's got a year-long residual with it, but it takes a little bit of time to be fully taken up in order to get that protection in that tree. So if you're going to be treating kind of right in the heart of the summer, a lot of times what happens is you're not going to be getting peak amounts of insecticide in that tree by the time that you want to be having it there. Transect is one that kind of the opposite with it. That's a great one where it has fairly fast uptake time. It takes about like a week or two to be fully taken up into the tree, but it has a shorter residual associated with it, generally about 3 or so months for that. And so you want to be cognizant of the timing that you're going to be putting that in there. So that'll be something that it's a great as a just-in-time treatment that can be done in the kind of spring/summer timeframe, but you do not want to be applying that in the fall timeframe. And that's because if you apply that in the fall, that active ingredient is going to be gone by the time that you want to have that in there. But lastly, with Mectinite, that's something that you can apply year-round as long as you have 3/4 leaf development, and you want to stop doing treatments once the leaves have dropped with it. But the key part is you want to have peak amounts of insecticide in the xylem of the tree when the eggs hatch and the larvae start to feed. And that's going to be around that July to October timeframe with it. And so to kind of give a recap of some of the pros and cons with the kind of the different application methods as well as the different active ingredients. So for Zytec and Transect, these are best used as preventative applications and under some of these low EAB pressure areas. Additionally, you're going to be wanting to use this on some of the smaller trees, as when you get to these larger trees, it's not going to be as effective as using emamectin benzoate. The pros of these are they're fast and easy to apply, especially with Zytec. It's cost effective and has a long application window. The cons with the Zytec is it has slower uptake. It takes about generally say about 1 to 2 months to be fully taken up into the tree, and so you have to be cognizant about that. Additionally, with both Zytec and Transect, whenever you're dealing with a lot of trees within a confined area, there are pounds per acreage restrictions associated with those chemicals. So those are things to take into consideration, whereas it might be a better option for you to be shifting over to emamectin benzoate product. Additionally, with Transect, that's the dinotefuran one. This is great for a kind of a fast and easy to apply. Like I said, you can do a systemic bark spray with that. It's great for a just-in-time treatment. But the big thing is you do not want to be doing any sort of fall treatments just because you're not going to be having active ingredient in that tree at the time that you want to have that. But then for trunk injection, this is where Mectinite comes into play. And this is for a 2-year protection, and you can do for therapeutic treatments. Additionally, with some of the data that Dr. Sadof was showing in there, that this treatment interval can be extended at times. The pros of this is you can protect trees of all sizes, small and large. And additionally, if you're what happens a lot of times in some of these urban environments, you have kind of the concrete around some of these trees and under the boulevard. Doing tree injections with Mectinite are a great option when soil treatments are not possible at all. The cons with doing any sort of the trunk injections is they require specialized equipment. You can't just do a soil drench with it. And also it does involve tree wounding because you are having to actually drill into the tree. So some things that you can do with that is try to minimize your impact with it by using injection systems that you have a smaller drill bit going in, or don't require the use of kind of some of the plugs or any of the items that might hinder some of the compartmentalization or the rates of compartmentalization. So with that, it was just kind of a brief overview of some of those things that Dr. Sadof did mention the most of those as well. But want to kind of get into some of the Q&A portion. So if you have any sort of questions, please enter those into the Q&A portion of the control panel. We'll try to answer some of the questions in the order that they're received. Just wanted to highlight as well that we do have some additional upcoming webinars. This is kind of kicking off some of the EAB portion of the webinars that we'll be putting on over these next couple weeks. The next one will be next week at this same time frame, and it's going to be put on by Jeff Hafner, who is here at Rainbow, as well as Dr. Bob Haight, talking about EAB cooperative management. And so I also wanted to thank all of you for attending. And like I said, we'll get to some questions in just a little bit. At the end of this, there'll be a survey we ask you to fill out and just kind of give some ratings on this. And lastly, while we're answering some questions, wanted to have this up in here. This is some of the instructions for how to obtain some of the state pesticide applicator credits if you are in those states that are mentioned in here. And we will have the links to those posted in the chat in just a little bit. That's everything I have right now. Then would like to open the board to the Q&A then.
Yeah, I can see the questions here. I'll go through one at a time. That's okay with you, Eric?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay, so Lisa Nelson had a question. I'm just reading the names. Is the increased control because more product was injected to the tree through 8 ports versus 4 ports? The answer is no, because we injected exactly the same amount of product per inch DBH through the ports. So we controlled this. We controlled for the amount of product that went inside the tree. So the second question was Melissa Valoon. We treat every 2 years the ivermectin benzoate. Is an imidacloprid drench with the first treatment beneficial at all? No. In a word, you can only kill these things once. All right, and the ivermectin benzoate is so toxic, you do not need to double up that first year. I mean, it might make you feel better, but it's not going to do you any good. Jeff Pitcher, if you treat an ash tree with imidacloprid every year for 5 years at the 10 mil rate, can you still continue with the same product if the neighboring property has infested and dying trees? Okay, so okay, you know, there's lots of ifs there, and I guess I'm going to try and think of it like this. If you have a lot of emerald ash borer pressure and the trees are surrounded by untreated trees, imidacloprid is probably not the way to go, okay, because the chances of messing up are, you know, each year, you know, the timing, if your timing's a little bit off, there's lots of room for error. And I think if you start thinking about what the actual cost is on a annual basis, especially if you're going to a 3-year treatment, you might be coming, there may not be that much of a difference. But yeah, do you want to jump in that one, Eric?
Yeah. I mean, I would say for that one, if you're treating with imidacloprid on an annual basis for that, and you have a neighboring property that has infested and dying trees, that's a good indication to try to switch over, most likely, to using ivermectin benzoate for that. You're going to be getting better control with that. And that sounds like if your neighbor's tree is dying, you're going to be in more of a high pressure area, and that's where imidacloprid is going to be better for areas where it's kind of low to medium pressure, more as good at preventative treatments. Once you start getting the high pressure, kind of situation, that's when you're going to be wanting to shift over to ivermectin benzoate.
Richard Wilson had a question. What is the largest DBH applications that are effective? We actually have in that study, that large tree study at Eagle Creek, some of our trees had a DBH of 60 inches. Okay.
Yeah, and
these are monsters.
That is a massive tree.
Right.
And just to clarify what this looks like, is saying bark applications.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no. So that's a good point that you're getting at with there. You can treat trees up to 60 inches with emamectin benzoate doing the kind of tree injection method. When you're switching over to the bark applications, that's going to be what you're going to be doing with the Transect or the active ingredient dinotefron. And for 60 inches, definitely wouldn't be touching that. And I like to say kind of a good rule of thumb is under 25 inches. That's going to be what it's best for. But it's even smaller than that. And like I said, it's going to be good for some of the low to moderate pressure areas.
Yep. Peter Fixler, is mectinite still effective in a drought situation after injection, or do you need to irrigate? You need to irrigate because that product isn't going to be taken up. You can jam it into a tree in a drought, but it's going to be a lot easier to get that material in there if that tree is transpiring. And what gets in there is going to take a lot longer to get up into the canopy where it needs to do its job. Mr. Anonymous, Mr. and Ms. Anonymous attendee. Does viscosity of product have anything to do with how long it lasts in a tree? Would a thicker product last longer? Well, if I look at at the data from the what I call the Lafayette golf course, where we had triage the old formulation versus the mectinite formulation, it was virtually identical in terms of that. So I don't think it matters.
Yeah, and that's the same thing that we've found as well. Viscosity doesn't exactly correlate to having a longer residual. It's more so viscosity is related to kind of uptake of that product initially, but in terms of kind of longer term efficacy with it, we haven't seen anything associated with that.
Yeah, and the last one is by David Lee, a question about tree wounding. So trees are amazing organisms in that they self-seal when things break. So, you can imagine, you think of a tree trunk with lots of small twigs, twigs that break and they fall off in nature. They fall off, the tree is able to seal the wound by growing bark around it. And that happens all the time. We're talking about really small holes here, right? Is it 3/8 or 3/6?
15/64 inch.
15/64 inch. Okay, yeah. So that's pretty
Quarter
small.
inch. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty small.
Yeah, and additionally with it, at the rate that you're going to be doing some of these applications, you're kind of doing on a 2, 3, and even later on, potentially going on like a 5-year basis when you're doing some of these applications. What I have found for myself personally, when I've done applications with mectinite, just as of last year, I did some applications in May, came back to my tree, it was in my front yard, came back over in August and couldn't even really see some of those spots anymore because the tree is able to compartmentalize over that fairly quick. And so I generally try to shy away from doing annual tree applications whenever it's tree injections, just to give the tree some time to compartmentalize some of that wounding. But when you're talking 2, 3, 5 years, the tree is going to compartmentalize over that, and so it doesn't become a concern with it.
Well, what about the old? Yeah. So, okay, if you're injecting and you have, you are not going to be able to see if you can't see the injections. I mean, really, you wouldn't want to inject right on top of an old one, but the chances of you doing that are pretty slim because you're only talking about this roughly quarter-inch size holes.
Yeah, and that's a big thing as well. For us, we use a plugless injection equipment, and so we don't. It allows the tree to kind of compartmentalize a little bit faster. And some of the cases that we found when we've used plugs in the past is trying to find kind of new spaces to go over, as if that the plug isn't kind of set correctly. Sometimes that can cause the tree to either push it out or it's not kind of compartmentalizing great around that. And so we've been able to, not even have to deal with some of those situations by using some of our plugless equipment. And, we're not having to kind of find these new spaces. And as Dr. Sadof was talking about, it's difficult to find even, where you even injected in the past with it. So it hasn't been a concern for us.
Yeah, there's a nice paper in the Journal of Arboriculture where they actually took some sections and cut cross sections on the trunk, and you can see where the injection occurred. You can see where it healed over, and there's good growth over the top of it. So yeah, so that's when you're going to a 3-year injection interval, you're giving your tree a lot more time to recover.
Yeah. Additionally, as we wait to see if there's any additional questions that come through in the chat portion of this, there is a link for an Emerald Ash Borer management guide that we created last year. It'll provide a little bit kind of guidelines, some suggestions for municipalities that are looking to implement an EAB management plan, some kind of tips and tricks, or if you're currently doing it, might provide some additional information for it. But it's a free piece. The link's in the chat. Feel free to go to that and take a look at that if you want.
I think we're good, and we are also at time.
All right.
Perfect.
Thanks a lot. This was fun.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Sadof, and coming to talk to us today about Emerald Ash Borer. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. We can put you in contact with Dr. Sadof or myself, and be happy to answer any questions after this. Thank you very much for all of your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.